Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Dagg's Manual of Theology. We're going to be moving into the section today where people most likely think of when they think about systematic theology and dealing with what is called theology proper or the doctrine of God. This is in Book 2 of the Manual of Theology. Today we intend to get through the introduction, which is the duty to love God, and then get into just briefly the existence of God. And what you'll find with the existence of God section, it's fairly small. Most of the systematic theologies would have a very large section dealing with proofs of the existence, but as is the case with the inspiration, Dagg also wrote another book in which he actually talks a little bit about this. In his apologetics book, he deals with it, and so he would refer us back to there, I think, for any more detail. So anyway, that's the way we're going to divide the morning up here. Would someone read from Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning perhaps in verse 5 and go down to verse 8, and read that aloud for us? I was going to read that from my phone, but it's currently on loan. And speak up so that the microphone up here can pick you up, hopefully.
6 what?
6, beginning in verse 5.
And until what?
Down to verse 8.
And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and thou shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thy hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes.
Okay. This little section there starts with the command to love God. And that's where Mr. Dagg likes to start as well, because he considers loving God a duty to be performed. And that's a little different from what you'd read in a lot of the systematic theologies. Everything set? Okay, all right. So let's have prayer, and then we'll just get right into the Dagg material. Father, we're grateful today that you are our God, and that you are a God worthy of our love, and that unlike the false gods and the gods of this age and the gods of ages past, you desire that kind of a relationship with your people. And so even though it's called a duty by Mr. Dagg, it is also a great pleasure and is a great privilege of ours to do that. And so help us today to show love to you and also to show love to others. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Dagg gets right into it and just jumps right into the several reasons why there is a duty of love to God. And I'm using a little different technology here, okay? And this is the passage of Scripture, this first section of it that we just read, begins with the Shema, which was recited by spiritual Israelites every day. The Lord our God is one Lord. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God. And it's a commandment that's reflected again in the New Testament. In Matthew 12, also the Gospel of Mark records it. Jesus telling us what the great commandment of the law is, and he goes right back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. You will love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. And this is the first and great commandment. And then he also adds to this the idea of loving neighbor coming to it. Now, there are 7 aspects I was able to find in the material that Dagg gives us here. The duty of love to God is immediate, and by that he means that there is no drawn-out investigation necessary, that this is a command that's relatively simple and straightforward, And number 2, the duty of love to God corresponds to Christianity. It fits the faith, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes when we compare the stories about the other gods, the myths and the legends and so on. And number 3, the duty of love to God is simple, plain even to humble minds. You don't have to be a deep thinker to love God, and there's very little preparation necessary to be somebody who loves God. And even though the love to God is a simple duty, it also is comprehensive in that the love to God tends to overflow, and it begins to affect others and affect your relationship with others and society around you at large here. If you don't get all these down, I will be making the notes here available to you, so, okay. The duty of love to God is a love of benevolence. This is something that Sherry had a question about when she was working on it. What was it? There's an adjective that he uses when he talks about the benevolence of it. And he gives us a very good definition. It's the disposition to do good to an object. We talk about being a benevolent person, having a benevolent offering. That's just simply thinking about doing good to others. And then the duty of love to God includes a love of complacence. Now, we talked about this briefly a time or two ago, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Complacence today means lackadaisical or not having any firm opinion on anything. That's not what complacence means in a classical, theological, or philosophical. It has to do with having a special love in which you take delight, and the thing that is being loved also reciprocates in some way. And that's what we talk about, complacent love. Ordinarily, and the Puritans used to talk about this an awful lot. They talked about the love of God to all mankind being a benevolent love, but the love of God to those who are in Him, those that are in the faith, was considered to be a complacent love. In other words, He delighted in those that received His Son and showed faith in His Son as they delighted in Him. And so you can love food. He uses the example, I think, in there about how Isaac loved savory meat. And he says, well, that's not really much of a complacent love. The meat's not going to love you back. But complacent love is nearly always used in reference to a sentient being, another person then. And then number 7, the duty of love to God incorporates joy in God's happiness then. Okay, so those are the 7 things. And we'll go back and cover each one of those in just a little bit more detail now. The duty of love to God is immediate. By that, Dagg is telling us that you don't need a lot of preparation in order to learn how to love God, and you don't have to investigate it a great deal. It's just kind of laying out there in the open for us to pick up then. He cites Romans 1:19, and he'll be coming back to that again later on when he talks about the existence of God. And this is the passage in the book of Romans that deals with that which may be known of God. It has to do with God having His image stamped inside human beings, how they suppress that image and they don't let it come out because of their sin. But he's always wanting to be practical. He always wants to have a devotional aspect to all of his theological teaching. And so he says this to those who would plead that they might know more about Him and that they want to know more before they actually get ready to love Him. He says this, we already know enough of Him for this, and to postpone the performance of the duty until we have completed our investigations is to commence them with unsanctified hearts and in rebellion against God. I never kind of thought of it that way. I always kind of thought, well, if you are a believer and you're trying to learn more about God so that you can begin to love Him, Dagg says that's really kind of a disobedient spirit there. You need to just start off. That there's already enough knowledge of God in you built in because you're a human being and you have the image. And then, of course, once you have the Holy Spirit and once you've been converted to Christ and expressed faith, those kinds of things, then you can just jump right into the whole idea of loving God. And you don't have to stop and think about it a long time. You don't have to involve yourself in a lot of philosophical speculation in order to do that then. Secondly, the love of God corresponds to Christianity. It fits the faith that we proclaim. He contrasts the worship of false gods with the worship of the true God, commenting this way: heathen gods could not claim the supreme love of their worshipers. If you have studied any of the, especially I'm thinking about the Greco-Roman gods, you don't find very much lovability in that cast of characters. They're mischievous, they're downright evil sometimes, playing tricks on each other and on mankind, and they're basically just grown-up big children, with lots and lots of power and towering abilities. He says these false gods could not call for the love of their worshipers because they're not worthy of such love. They're just not that lovable. In fact, even the people of their day, if they had virtue, said the gods themselves were not virtuous. I mean, even they knew that. Their actions were so immoral that their worshipers would even disapprove. This is not so with the God of the Bible and the salvation that He has worked in His Son, Jesus Christ. And in view of such a religion, what could be more fitting than the duty of love to God? And then you look at the Scripture itself. God is love. You don't see anything like that in the Greco-Roman systems, where God is love or that God loved the world. And so it's appropriate, Dagg says, that we should love God in return since He has loved us. Number 3, the duty of love to God is a simple duty. He acknowledges, Dagg does, the perplexities of the finer points of religion and morality, but the duty of love to God is plain even to humble minds. He says you don't have to understand gravity. He uses that example. You don't have to understand gravity to know that if you jump off a bed into the floor, you're going to go down. You don't have to form any scientific complex ideas about that or theories about it then. It's just simply going to happen. And so he says the duty of love is a simple principle that binds every human being in religion. And remember, when he speaks of religion in his theology, and I'll be making reference to it a little bit later on too, he's talking about religion here in a good sense. Today people would use the word spirituality probably rather than religion. People say, I don't believe in religion, I believe in Christianity, and that's different. Christianity's not a religion. Well, it is too, yeah, in the classical definitions. And he's using it in the classical sense here. But he says the duty of love to God is admirable. And I like this. He says, the learned philosopher stands in the presence of this precept as a little child. Well, this echoes what Jesus said, that except you become as little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. And he says it feels its power binding every faculty that he possesses here. There are concepts and basics of our faith that are difficult to wrap our minds around sometimes, and we can get into some fairly complex formulations. If you enjoy that sort of thing, this last week I think it was in Pastor's sermon, he talked a little bit about the decrees of God. And if you enjoy, wandering through theological wildernesses, you ought to go back and see what the so-called Ordo Salutis, that is the order of salvation in classical Reformed theology. And you have basically 3 or 4 different schools of thought. There are 5 decrees of God having to do with the creation of the world, creation of man, allowing sin, affecting salvation, how to apply salvation, and so on. There were 5 of them, and they show up in different orders among those 5. And back in the olden days, the Reformed theologians would fight over that the way that we fight over whether women ought to wear pants or not. You know that. They would really get down on those kinds of discussion, those arguments then. And so there are some things that it is good for us to ponder and to think about and to have firmly in our mind, the concept of repentance, faith, and so on. Even the forms of worship, I think, can come under some investigation. But the whole idea of loving God is easily grasped. Anybody can do that. And it can be easily understood and practiced then. And so the love of God is a simple idea then. And then the duty of love to God is simple, but at the same time it's also comprehensive. The duty of love to God incorporates love to mankind that is made in His image. The duty of love to God not only gives rise to the love of man, but without the former, the latter cannot be. He's going to have something to say here in a few minutes about loving yourself. But it's interesting that Jesus, our Lord, actually did connect the love of God with love of neighbor. The second is like unto it. You don't see that actually explicitly stated that way in the Old Testament. You merely have the statement that you will love the Lord thy God with all your heart. And then it goes in and talks about this is the way that you get these things into your children. But Jesus comments, it's his commentary on that. You will love the Lord your God and you will love your neighbor as yourself. Because in the mind of Jesus, and I think in the Scriptures, the love of neighbor flows from the love of God. And it's difficult to have a proper love of neighbor unless you also have the love of God preceding it then. And that's the point that he's trying to make here. He says, we love our neighbors because they are God's creatures and the subjects of His government and because He has commanded us. The duty of love comprises obedience to His commands. And so he's saying that if you truly love God, you will obey God. And the reason Christians obey God is because they delight to please God in all they say and do. And in this way, the duty of love to God also kind of promotes the universal good. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself is really a comprehensive statement that builds on commandments 5 through 10 of the 10 Commandments. The first 4 of the commandments have to do with the way you relate to God. You'll have no other gods, you won't take the name of the Lord in vain, you won't have any idols, and you'll remember the Sabbath day. Beginning with number 5, honor your mother and your father. And then 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 all have to do with how you treat other people. And so by taking 6 through 10 and sort of taking that, then comprehending it into a very concise statement, you will love your neighbor. How do you love your neighbor? And of course, neighbor here includes mother, father, brother, sister, and so on. Which is a pretty good concept to use whenever you're doing marriage counseling, by the way. When you start thinking of your wife as a sister for whom Christ died, or you think of your husband as your brother as well as your husband, then it's not icky at all. It really has a kind of a nice flavor to it. So by refusing to steal from other people and refusing to lie to other people and refusing to covet what they have and those kinds of things, then you are showing love to those neighbors then. And so in this way, then, the duty of love to God promotes universal good. Who would not want, he says, to live in a world where every citizen loved God and others? Wouldn't that be a nice thing? And he envisioned a deplorable society in which all kinds of affections had vanished. On the other hand, he says, perfect obedience to the great law of love is sufficient to render all creatures happy. I saw a good example of this back several years ago. In 2012, in December 2012, George Will, who is a political columnist that you may have heard of, may have read some of his materials. I followed him off and on for years. And he gave a lecture at Washington University in St. Louis. That was very interesting because the lecture had to do with how religion benefits American society and how it has from its founding up to the present time. And I remembered watching it and being surprised that Mr. Will, who I knew to be a secularist and a practical atheist, he probably would consider himself more an agnostic. But if you know anything at all about Mr. Will, you know he's not a religious man, was not brought up in a religious world. But he understands the necessity for religion in the life, in the national life, in the civic life of a nation then. And I was surprised that he had so many good things to say about religion and civil life. For the founders, he says, the natural rights that we have, he said, were grounded in human nature and were considered normative rather than a merely contingent fact. This view is buttressed by the teaching of biblical religion that nature is not chaos, but rather is the replacement of chaos by an order reflecting the mind and will of the Creator. This is what the founders had in mind when they talked about Creator, when they talked about providence, when they spoke of God. These were the things they had in their minds then. The Creator is part of the American proposition and recognized in the Declaration of Independence as the one, quote, who endows us with natural rights that are inevitable, inalienable, and universal, and hence the foundation of democratic equality. And these rights are the foundation of limited government. Government defined by the limited goal of securing those rights so that individuals may flourish in their free and responsible exercise of those rights. Well, you can see, if you're a student of world history, you can see where when Christian religion is practiced rightly and is not a part of the coercion of the state, but is allowed to flourish freely alongside the state, those societies tend to turn out pretty well. But you start suppressing biblical religion, then things don't go so well for you. And in fact, in his lecture, he pointed out how Western Europe had, over the last couple of hundred years, largely abandoned the whole idea of religious faith and how badly that has worked out for them. Now, the interesting thing, and the reason I bring all this up is, he's extolling the virtues of what it would mean. This is not to say that every American citizen loves God or every American citizen has this, but there is at the bottom this sort of bedrock idea that underlies the whole idea of liberty, and part of that liberty has to do with a belief and a love for God. That's what he's saying. Philosophically, they go hand in hand. And when you remove that, he said everything's up for grabs. Then the state becomes God or something else becomes God, and then you wind up with coercion and tyranny and so on. Now, given the fact that he himself is not a religious man, and yet he's talking about all these virtues of religion, it brought up a lot of questions. And at the end of the lecture, he has to answer some of these questions. And one of them in particular was this: the fellow said, he said, I understand what you're talking about, and I agree with you about about religion and civil life and those kinds of things. But he says, you don't have any religious faith. How do you reconcile that? And he said, I don't. Here's what he said. If there were a lot more people like me, we would be in big trouble. It's a funny thing for him to say, but he was being perfectly honest and transparent. He said, if we were in a nation full of atheists like me, he said, we'd be in big trouble right now without that kind of solid bedrock. And of course, there are elements in this country that like to pull us that direction and would like to wipe out references to religion in the public square and revise American history so that there is no religious faith to be found anywhere in there. So anyway, I didn't mean to get on a political bandwagon on this, but when I was working on this section here, I happened to think about that, George. By the way, you can find that lecture. It's on YouTube, and I've seen it in several different places. And it's a very, very good lecture. But the Q&A afterwards, there's about 30 minutes of Q&A, and that's really, really good, where he talks about this then. So I think Dagg would agree with Mr. Will. If everybody was like Will, we'd be in a lot of trouble. Dagg says, no, we are in a lot better shape if you have a society where people generally love God. I remember having those kinds of conversations when I was taking grad school over at the Missouri State. And in most of the courses I went, I was kind of like the lone voice for, conservative religious faith there. And you'd hear people talk about, well, it never really was Leave It to Beaver. It never really was this or that. And it never really was. America never was a family full of the beaver cleavers, It really wasn't. But there was the ideal. There was the ideal out there that you had a dad who would go to work and would provide for the family, and he would discipline his boys, and they would know right from wrong, and mom would make sure that she took care of things at home that needed to be taken care of, and I don't remember my mom ever running around in high heels and pearls the way Mrs. Cleaver did. That's pure fantasy, of course.
It's probably more like Aunt B.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
There was a little bit more realism with Andy Griffith
Yeah.
because it was kind of a dysfunctional family, but at the same time still holding to those
Exactly.
that structure and that ideal. Yeah.
Exactly. It said you went to church on Sunday, you went to preaching is what they called it on Andy Griffith and those kinds of things. And even though in many ways that seems like otherworldly, it provided an ideal that if people had their choices, would they rather live in a criminal family where you couldn't trust anybody and everybody's abusing one another, or would you rather live with the Cleavers? I'd rather live with the Cleavers, it'd be boring part of the time, but at the same time you could sleep at night, yeah.
It sounds, honestly, it kind of sounds to me, and I haven't heard his lecture. I'd be interested to listen to it, but it sounds like he probably has more faith than he's letting on, and that he's just in rebellion.
Who, Mr. Will? Oh, I think so, yeah.
To come to an understanding that profound, that basically he's admitting to his state as in depravity.
Mm-hmm.
To admit that, and to recognize that so fully, and yet continue to stay in it, you have to have some sort of, you have to know more and really understand more of what it means, but also deny it.
He's an atheist not because he doesn't believe in God. He's an atheist because he wills to be an atheist.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly, yeah.
I think there's a lot of actually people like that.
Mm-hmm.
Neil deGrasse Tyson is similar to.
Yeah. He
actually has a lot to say about religion and those constructs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a similar thing.
I felt the same way when I would read Stephen Hawking. Of course, Hawking comes out near the end of his life and said there is no God. Right. But a lot of times you read him and there's a God out there that he's thinking about. He just will not name him. You see that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Because that's Romans 1:19, isn't it? That there is something out there in creation that does speak. Yeah, it does speak. And it's not enough to get saved by, but it's certainly enough to understand that there is a God there. And that someday you're going to have to face up to it then. Let's see. Okay. The duty of love to God is a love of benevolence. That is, it promotes the happiness of others. This is very close to the one just before it. Benevolence is, Dagg says, the disposition to do good to an object. And this helps us to clarify what he meant by a duty of love to God. He contends that all mankind must be inclined to do good to God. This inclination needs to reside in the heart of every human being. Well, it needs to be, but of course it's not always there. And he says that this is not the same as a concept of self-love, and this he gets into kind of a complicated argument here. This is one of those places where if you're not thinking like Dagg, you'll get lost in the weeds pretty quickly here. But I thought it was interesting that here he is in the 1850s talking about self-love, which I thought was a fairly fairly modern kind of a concept. But
Well, did he introduce that topic before this chapter? The concept of self-love?
I don't know. I don't recall it in the other introductory material.
Yeah, because I'll be interested to see how he gets into that.
Yeah. Well, what he's saying is how he gets into that is he says that a love for God will promote doing good to others, including God and including others. And where he's going to argue, and it's really on the next slide here. Let me do this. We'll go back to it because since you asked the question here, he said that a natural view, and this is him speaking from the 1850s, philosophy and so on, which I thought the self-love idea. But you've heard people say things like this from the pulpit. You can't love God unless you love yourself first. That's not what Jesus said. Loving self is not a command. Loving self is a given. That's what we do. We preserve ourselves, you know. If somebody is trying to land a fist on your face, you're going to duck instinctively. You don't even have to think about it. You're going to try to preserve yourself. That is self-love. And when Paul speaks of the husband loving his wife, that he said when you do that, you're loving yourself, actually. He's not commanding you have to love yourself first. He's taking that as a given. And Dagg is also doing the same thing. But he says a natural view of trying to experience a love for God without any sort of biblical revelation whatsoever would see that a person would over time expand love from themselves and then would promote that love then to those very close to them, and then that love would spread to those much further away, and then finally would be extended to the general public, and then finally gaining the ability, you think, okay, well, I've loved all the things that are around me, now I can begin to learn to love the transcendent God. He says the Bible reverses that. And by beginning with the love of God, loving your neighbor, let alone loving yourself, does not lead to God or lead to loving God. It's just the reverse. That loving God as we should leads us then to love our neighbor. And so he opposes the concept of self-love here as a virtue. You're not commanded to love yourself in them. We are not commanded to love ourselves. It is assumed that we actually do that. He says self-love is not the first principle nor the central affection. He uses those phrases of virtue. Rather, to constitute virtue, there must be an intentional promotion of happiness in others, and this intention must be disinterested. Now, this is that disinterested benevolence. This is the question you had. What is disinterested benevolence? Disinterested benevolence means I'm going to do good to you whether you do good to me or not. It's, again, the biblical concept of doing good to others, especially those who cannot return it and cannot repay it. And that is called then an disinterested, an inclination towards disinterested benevolence. Okay, so everybody, were you surprised about this self-love thing showing up in 1850? I really was, because I thought that was strictly a 21st century thing.
I'm surprised by it being called by the exact term we still use.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
More modern term is self-image that we
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. Well, we talked about, I think the last time we were together, we were talking about this self-actualization thing that you guys were talking about, yeah. The same thing. Okay, where were you? Okay, let's see here. The love to God includes a love of complacence. And this is where you have to be careful about your definitions, make sure you understand what complacence. And it has to do with the love for God's character and what He is in Himself. He breaks off a little bit here and he talks about three different kinds of love. And remember now, he's speaking from a theological point of view here. There is the benevolent love, and he's also, has already defined benevolence for us. It's the disposition to do good to something else that's out there. Beneficent love is the actual conferring of that good, and it has to do with the effect of that love. We talk about benefits of a certain situation. That's what benevolence, beneficence, and then complacence or complacency. And the complacency thing is the thing I really had a hard time. I had to go back and I had to read about half a dozen different articles written by Reformed authors to really figure out exactly how, because they differ a little bit, each one of them from the other then. But it has to do with a love that takes a delight, and that there's a growing affection. In other words, for you, as you're loving God, you will find things in God and in that relationship that cause you to want to love Him even more. It's a love that kind of feeds back off itself. There's this idea in the New Testament, and I don't know exactly what all that entails, but there is a concept in the New Testament about how at some point in the future we believers will be glorified by God. And when I think of glorification and glory, I always think about, shining objects, things like that. And I'm wondering, do I want to be shiny all through the eternity or something? Is that what we're talking about here? Then there are other people who say, no, I don't want anything like that. I just simply want, people will say things, I just like to have, a little cabin in heaven or something like that. We don't really understand what all is going to go on, and we don't understand what all the concept of glory is. But the concept of complacent love, as God shows complacency toward us, is the way that we show complacent love to our children by putting the awards that they get at school up on a refrigerator or a picture that they draw. It's horrible art. It's horrible. You couldn't, nobody would want to buy it. But it's valuable to you because of the person who did it and the motivation behind it. It's like the Southern concept of I'm proud to know you kind of a thing here. That's what complacent love is. It's taking a real delight in a person, in so much that as you place more of yourself into that person, and I'm speaking here about God, as God puts more of Himself into us, it's natural for Him to love us even more, and then for that affection to increase. And the same thing is true of us. The more we know of God, and the more we apprehend and comprehend what God has done and who He is, our love should be growing at the same time. And so it's a complacent love in that kind of a concept. I don't know how in the world the meanings of the word complacency change so that now it means something that basically you don't have much thought of something. But that, of course, is not at all what Dagg is talking about. And it's not what the other Reformed theologians were talking about either then. Dagg explains that the duty of love to God includes more than gratitude for the benefits that are received from God. He said, gratitude is an appropriate response to the many blessings that God bestows upon His children. Nevertheless, the duty of love to God regards more than this. It pertains to a love and affection of God as He is in Himself. So, of course, we're grateful. We're grateful for God, and we're grateful for what He has done. But He, let's see, what He is in Himself. And he talks a little bit here about God's natural attributes and His moral attributes. And he's going to get into the attributes of God in the next section. We're not going to get there today. But he'll go into those a lot more deeply. But here he wants to say, at least in this section, that although God's natural attributes call for respect, they do not always call for love. In other words, the natural attributes of God would be like omnipresence, omnipotence, His abilities as His abilities as Creator, and so on. Those things that make God what He is and makes Him so different from us. We admire those. We admire God's natural attributes, But it's his moral attributes that make him attractive to us and cause us to love him. He says God's natural attributes, like his omnipresence, omnipotence, and eternity, spark admiration, but a divine being could possess these natural attributes and not be a good or loving being. He said, in fact, a divine being could possess all these and be a tyrant. But when it comes to God's moral attributes, goodness, truth, justice, and so on, the human heart is warmed with appropriate affection. Okay. Are you clear on the distinction there between natural attributes and moral attributes? Those things that make him worthy of admiration, but not necessarily an object of love. But the moral attributes make him attractive to us so that we would want to love him then. I've got that misnumbered there. The duty of love to God incorporates joy in his happiness. And we desire to increase his happiness. There's kind of a conundrum here, because there's no way in the world we can increase God's happiness. I can increase your happiness by cutting my sermon short or by giving you a donut or something like that. That'd make people happy. So I can increase your happiness pretty simply. God is happy in himself, and we cannot increase his happiness, but we want to. That's the point that Dagg is making. We have a desire to do that. He says, if we delight in the happiness of God, we shall labor to please him in all things, and to do whatever he commands, and to advance all the plans, the accomplishment of which he has so much at heart. I love Dagg. He can really turn a phrase, can't he? And make something both simple and complex at precisely the same time. Anyway, if you take all these things together then, he says, love, therefore, includes obedience to his commands and resignation and admission to his will. Love to God will render it a pleasing task to examine the proofs of his existence, and this is his natural segue into the next section, having to do with the existence of God. But the duty of love to God is kind of Dagg's whole theological framework. And that's the reason why he starts with the duty of love to God rather than starting with the existence of God and the attributes of God. He wants to make it plain. It's that devotional thing that he's after. He doesn't want you to be able to rattle off attributes. He wants you to be able to love God. And by loving God, then you learn more about these attributes and learn how they go. And then, so we'll stop here, take a little break, and then we'll come back and look at the existence if you don't have any other questions. This is probably where we get into a section of Dagg's theology where he seems much more like some of the other theologians of his time and the other classic systematic theologies. But the way he approaches proofs for the existence of God, even at that, is a little different. Here are his 4 proofs that he's going to be talking about. Moral nature, we've talked about that in one of the earlier sessions. That's classical theology. That's called a teleological argument for the existence of God. Teleological. Teleological. And then number 2, the existence of the world. That's a cosmological argument. And that's the way it would be phrased in most theology textbooks. And number 3, the argument that there is a God and it has been confirmed by the common consent of mankind. We've seen that argument before, didn't we? In fact, I'll show you that in a minute. Yeah, yeah. And then number 4, revelation. Now, this looks very similar to something that he has already done before. When he said that there are these common beliefs that have been held for a long, long time and all over the world. Not universally held by every single individual, But he's making an argument here for the moral nature demonstrates the existence of God. In other words, why, if there is no God, why do you find God showing up all over the place in people's thoughts and writings and thinking, and from the most primitive all the way to the most advanced civilizations then? And he had these, in fact, these are the four things that he talked about early on in his manual. Talked about these things that are just sort of held in common, that there is a God, that he ought to be worshipped, that there's a difference between virtue and vice. Lots of disagreement on what is virtue and vice, but just about any society has their rules. And then number four, that there is a moral government. These are things that people assent to. And the reason why we have a government and we don't live in anarchy where every man's for himself and just doing whatever he thinks or whatever. Then. And so his argument is that this moral nature of ours, the idea that we share these things almost universally, does demonstrate that there is a God. He says that the conscience works in every human being as a moral governor. Again, people will disagree on what morality and immorality may look like when it's acted out, but even the most irreligious person will have some code of conduct that he or she is living by then. And the moral governor, he says, is critical because society depends on the moral character of its citizens. Otherwise, we'd be out there stealing from one another, clubbing from one another. Remember that love to neighbor means we don't steal from each other, we don't tell lies to one another, and we don't cheat on one another, and we treat one another with respect. And it's a moral governor in us that makes us want to do these things. He says, banish from every member of society the restraints which this conscience and the moral sense of the community impose on him, and you'll desolate the earth or convert it into a hell. And I would refer you back to what George Will said a little while ago when he said if everybody was like him, we'd be in serious trouble. And Dagg here is simply saying if everybody simply did whatever they wanted to without some sort of a moral governor, then we really would be in trouble then. One of his arguments is that we have civil governments that are instituted to administer justice. Paul makes the exact same argument in Romans chapter 13. And when he encourages in the letter to Timothy to seek the good of those that are in authority and to pray for them, because as bad as human governments are, they're better than no kind of a government whatsoever. That there are at least some sort of restraint and constraint held over evil then. And he highlighted that as grateful as human beings may be for these civil governments, Dagg highlights that humans have never found an earthly government that is completely satisfactory. Right. What was it Churchill said? Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Right. And the lack of that complete satisfaction beckons us, he says, for another governor. The idea of God's existence as the moral ruler of the universe accords precisely with the tendencies and demands of our moral nature. And without admitting it, our moral faculties and the phenomena which they exhibit are totally inexplicable. Where does the sense of right and wrong come from? Even though people may disagree on what those things may look like. Where does that come from? He says, without God in the mix, it's really, you cannot explain it. It just simply would not be there. It's not like, I think he uses the example back in his introduction from a few weeks ago. He talked about how birds, when they're born, do not learn how to make nests. They just do it. And they make nests now exactly the same way they did 5,000 years ago. And it's inexplicable that they would do that unless there's something governing them, you see. And he's just taking it a step further and taking these instincts that we see in animals and is providing the same sort of moral governor kind of a thing inside the minds and the spirits of human beings then. He says these things not only prove the existence of God, but they also speak of his character and as the moral ruler of the universe. And so even when he's talking about the existence of God, even when he's doing apologetic work, Dagg is still going right back to the spiritual again and going back to the devotional and having the affection for God. He says a sense of dutiful devotion begins to arise from this very first defense of the existence. He concludes that mankind is under a moral obligation because God is the moral governor of the universe. Second, the existence of the world, and I love this word, contrivances. I'm going to start using that word more often. The contrivances which it contains demonstrates the existence of God. By contrivances, he means the way it works. Weather patterns, gravity, the physical world around us. We are not aware of it, of course, but you know, of course, that the Earth is not only rotating, but it's also traveling around a huge orbit, going through space thousands and thousands of miles per second, hour perhaps. I forget what the exact speed is. And all these things floating around, doing their things out there in the universe, these are contrivances. The reason why it's cold in some places and hot in other places and rainy in some places and dry in other places, these are contrivances, the way the world works. Then we would use the term cosmological argument, or the more modern term, intelligent design. They work this way because they were designed to work this way. The truth of God's existence is vividly displayed in the working of the world. It's a cause and effect relationship that appear constantly in the universe that prove that God does exist. This is the one time when Dagg kind of goes back to some classic theology. This is one of the arguments that Thomas Aquinas made back in the 13th century, 14th. I forget how far back he was. But he is focusing on empirical evidence to prove that there is God. Dagg does not do that. He's a presuppositionalist. But it becomes the basis then for the modern argument for intelligent design. And the power for this argument comes from the fact that we see God at work daily. He says we meet it in the sunbeams, which impart to plants and animals the warmth necessary to life. We behold it in the descending shower which fertilizes the earth and causes the grass to grow. We find it in the bones of the body, fitted for their respective motions, in the throbbing heart, the circulating blood, the digesting stomach, and the heaving lungs. Dagg's a bit of a poet, isn't he, when you get right down to it? And he's making the same kind of argument. You know, Jesus made this argument in Matthew chapter 6 when he was talking about the lilies of the field, talking about the birds of the air. He was talking about creation. And he says, don't you see God at work in these things? And he said, don't you think that the same God that takes care of these things will also take care of you? Sunbeams, which impart to plants and animals the warmth necessary to life. I love that whole paragraph then. So when the devotional heart grasps these truths, the whole world then becomes a theater of worship. And that's the reason why we marvel at beautiful sunsets and massive canyons, and at the same time can be terrified of thunderstorms and massive cataclysms and those kinds of things. Every place man goes, he can behold God at work, and it renders to him. Once you see God at work, you have a duty to love God, Dagg says. And he moves then from that then to the existence of God. The doctrine that there is a God is confirmed by the common consent of mankind. Now, we didn't actually vote on it. Again, it's one of those things that you just see. All mankind has engaged in some sort of worship of a ruling invisible power. It's there. There have been many different societies of mankind throughout history. Some of them have not advanced very far, but there has always been a common belief in the existence of the divine throughout nearly all of these generations. And Dagg takes this universal witness as a strong evidence for the existence of God. Now, understand, none of these things are infallible. All of these things can be argued against, and they have been argued against over and over and over again. But once you start building up a kind of a catalog of these different evidences here, you make a pretty good case. It's not like that you're just, wishing God out of thin air. These are valid arguments, and they're valid arguments still. But he always likes to take us back to the Bible when he can. Genesis 1:1, Hebrews 11:6. And we talked about this before, that Genesis does not open up with an argument as to whether or not God exists, but simply just assumes. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Hebrews 11:6. If you come to God, you have to believe that He is. It's a fundamental principle of religion. It's funny, and I know you've seen this in social media and your conversations with your friends and so on. It's amazing how many people reject the Bible, but at the same time embrace a lot of what the Bible teaches without knowing it. For instance, there are a lot of people who would claim that, for instance, you really can't know much about God because there's all sorts of different ways to visualize God. But I've never met anybody who actually believes there's more than one God. They may disagree on who God is or what God is, or what He is, but I've never met anybody who says there's more than one God. Where does the concept of monotheism come from? It is a biblical concept. And so by embracing the idea of, "Hear, O Israel, our God is one," they are embracing a biblical truth and at the same time rejecting biblical truth. And so many of the things that they assume that they think they know about Jesus and what He has done are the only evidence we have for some of those things is actually what the Bible itself teaches. And they may agree or disagree with your view of Jesus, or who He is, what He did, and that kind of a thing. But most of what they do believe actually would actually have some sort of a biblical root to it. But they would think that they're just sort of intuiting it themselves then. Psalm 14:1 says that those who do not acknowledge the existence of God are fools. He said in his heart, there is no God. Or I like the way that Hebrew literally says this, the fool has said in his heart, no God. Just simply, no God. He lives as though there's no God. He has no concept of God in his thinking. And as he goes about daily business, it just simply doesn't even enter his mind then. Psalm 19, 1 and 2, Romans 1:20, Job 12:7. All of these have to do with how there is a natural kind of a revelation. And again, it's a limited revelation. According to Romans chapter 1, you can gain some insight into the concept of God by looking at the world, but it's a fairly limited concept. The idea that there is a creator to whom we are responsible and there is a judgment to come is a part of the natural revelation according to Romans chapter 1. And Psalm 19, 1 and 2 has to do with God's handiwork. We see God at work in the universe. In Job 12, the same thing, talking about creation, so that there is in nature this revelation of God then. This is what I thought was, this is a quote that I grabbed from somebody else who was dealing with the Dagg's theology. And he says, the duty of love to God with its high regard for the law of God served an organizing function, as Dagg viewed God primarily as the moral governor of the world. And it's a pretty good lens, I think, to read Dagg through. Now, as we go into the next section, we're going to talk about the attributes of God. And we'll be starting with those natural attributes, his omnipresence, omnipotence, and so on. And then we will get into those moral attributes. And this is where he gets more into what we would consider to be classical theological kind of statements. Those things have not changed much as you go from theology to theology and generation to generation. They've been acknowledged for quite a long time, and it's a pretty good study, pretty fascinating study. I remember learning these things for the first time in Bible college. And remember, systematic theology is simply a way of organizing what we think we know about God from the way that the Bible is revealed to us then. Okay, questions, discussion?